Hi, I'm Elaine from Foodbod Sourdough, and in this video I'm going to answer all of the frequently asked questions that I receive about sourdough starters. Enjoy your starter, babies. So I'm here today to hopefully answer the most commonly frequently asked questions that I receive about sourdough starters. So I've made a note of the questions that I receive the most. I've got some things to show you, and hopefully throughout this video you'll be able to find whatever answer to whatever question you may have. When it comes to starters, there's often a lot of, especially when you first make one, there's often a lot of fear and confusion about whether you can kill a starter, whether it's working, what's going to work for you. And really, the first thing I'm going to tell you is it's a lot simpler than you think. It's very, very, very hard to kill a starter. Most starters that have problems are not dead. There's an awful lot of starters that have been thrown away unnecessarily, that have, the time has been over long before it's necessary. So hopefully what I'll do here is give you enough reassurance and information to realise that your starter is doing okay. So what I'm going to do is show you some healthy starters, some starters with some issues, and go through and answer the questions that I am typically asked. So one of the big questions, and the question I'm asked most regularly is, should I start again? Should I just chuck it and start again? And the answer is no. Never throw away your starter unless a starter has mold. And typically on a sourdough starter, the mold will be pink or orange. Unless it has mold, there's no reason to throw it away. So try and resist the temptation to think that's the answer. I never quite understand, if someone's put all this time and effort into a starter, why you would so quickly want to throw it away. So the answer is no, don't throw it away. So the next big question is often, why doesn't it grow? Or, what's wrong with it? So there's certain questions that I would go through to try and understand what's going on with someone's starter. So this is my lovely, healthy, happy starter. This is my star. And I fed her this morning so that I can show you what she looks like, so that you can see not only the bubbles on the surface, but also the texture up and around the side of the jar. So this is a very happy, healthy, grown starter. And that's what it needs to be. So if yours hasn't grown for any reason, there's usually a specific reason why. So typically, if you fed your starter and it hasn't responded and it hasn't grown, it could just be that it's cold and it needs more time. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to refer back to the room temperature every time. So if your starter was working quite happily in the summer, in the warmer temperatures, suddenly it's not working as well. It's because they're so susceptible to room temperature. So if it's become colder in your kitchen, it's going to take longer. So just give it a bit more time to do its thing. Resist the temptation to do what so many people do and stick it somewhere warm for hours on end. This is how you kill a starter. Or you don't kill it, but you affect your starter. Yes, heat will help to a certain extent, and what we've got in a starter is wild yeast. It's the wild yeast in the flour that makes it grow, and yeast responds to heat, but it will only respond for so long. So if you stick your poor little starter in the oven with the light on all night, it's going to get far too hungry, it's going to get thin and weak. If you stick it in your airing cupboard, it's going to do the same thing. So if you want to give it a bit of a boost and a bit of warmth, that's fine, but don't leave it for too long, because it won't grow. It will do a certain amount of growing, then it will get hungry and it will all start to flop. So if you think your starter isn't growing, that's one thing. It could be that it's cold. Another thing could be because the water you're using isn't working very well with it. The flour you're using isn't working very well with it. So a typical problem is that starters are too thin. So if your starter becomes thin, it's also therefore weak and it won't be able to grow. So if you have a thin consistency on your starter, and I'll show you the difference between what a decent consistency is and a thin one. A thin starter will never grow. It's not going to grow and it's not going to do the job in your dough. So something to look at is the thickness and the consistency of your starter. But also look at the water you're using, the flour you're using. Often people are using filtered water, bottled spring water, something like that. You don't need to use any of that. Your tap water is absolutely fine. If you live somewhere that's got heavily chlorinated water, you can always put some water in a jug, leave it out for 24 hours and the chlorine will evaporate off. But often tap water is your best option. So let me show you so that you can see what a good thickness of a starter is. So this is my happily grown fed starter. And what you can see here as I stir it is the thickness of that. You see the elasticity, how thick it is. This is a happy starter. And this is a really good thickness. So when I fed it, it was thicker than that. So as it's grown and aerated, it's loosened up a bit. But this is a good thickness for your starter. Okay, so that is something that you want to work towards, that kind of thickness. So if you feel your starter is thinner than that, the best thing to do is to remove half, feed it your 30 grams of flour, and then only enough water to keep it nicely thick. Now I can never tell anybody how much water because it depends on your starter. So it depends what's going on in your kitchen. So give it the flour first and give it a stir and then just enough water to loosen it up. Then do your usual thing, put your lid on, leave it somewhere so that it can grow and then see what happens. And in this instance, we want the lid on without any clips or anything like that so that any gases can easily come out of the jar. But you want thick. You want a thick starter. So to show you a comparison, let me just get this other starter so we can answer some other questions and then you can start to see as well some consistency. So another question I'm asked is, why has my starter got liquid on the top? So this, hopefully you can see some of this. This is a hungry starter. So this starter is not dead. Don't throw it away. It's not dead, it's not ruined. This is a starter that has been left too long in the fridge, on the side, in heat, and as a result, it ferments and ferments and ferments, and it produces this layer of liquid that's basically coming out of the starter. So often called hooch, and it will smell strongly as well. All this is a hungry starter. It's not dead, it's just hungry. So you have choices now with this. You can either pour it off, stir it and feed it, or you can stir it in. So I'm jumping about a bit here, but whilst I've got it in front of me, it helps me answer other questions. So if your starter has ended up like this, you've got all this hooch on it, and it's also a perfect time to make your starter stronger. So if you ever ask the question of how do I make my bread more sour, how do I make my starter more sour, if it gets hungry like this, and you then stir in the liquid it's created, you'll get a stronger, more sour loaf and a more sour starter. So some people, I would recommend to actually actually force your starter to get hungry, because when you then stir this in, you actually stir in an awful lot of flavour. So what I'm going to do with this one is stir it in just to show you. So this is your hooch. This is the liquid that this has formed on here. And it's all just come out of your starter. So the starter underneath will be quite thick because the liquid has come out of it. So what I'm going to do is stir that. It's going to take a bit just to stir it in. And then we can show you what happens. So when you stir it in, even though the liquid came from it in the first place, what you often then end up with is quite a thin starter, as you can see. So this now helps me to show you what the consistency of a thin starter is. So if your starter looks like this on the top, and I can't really tip it to show you much, but if it's got a flat surface like this and teeny tiny bubbles on the surface, this is a hungry starter. This is a thin starter. Okay, so a flat surface, no activity, teeny tiny bubbles, much too thin. It's not going to grow, and it's not going to grow your dough. So this shows you the consistency of a thin starter. That, far too runny. That's not going to achieve anything for you. So the comparison, here is your lovely thick starter. Here is your much too thin starter. So if your starter is like this goes back to, it's not going to grow. You're not going to achieve anything with it. Remove half, feed it your flour portion, and then feed it just enough water so that it's nicely thick for it to be able to grow again. And that will be your solution. So this is just to show you what the consistency is like. Smells great. I mean, it smells great because it's been so hungry. But that will show you. So at any point that your starter has got like this, whether you're making a new starter, whether it's your existing starter, just, give it the flour and less water and you'll be absolutely fine. So this goes to the question as well of people wanting to leave their starters if you're going to go away or you're not going to be around. Often I'll get the question of, I'm going away for 2 weeks, what do I do with my starter? Nothing. You just put it in the fridge. If you want to, you can put the clips on the jar. But all you need to do is just leave it in the fridge. Nothing special you need to do with it. Neighbours don't need to come in and feed it. But if you do get home and you've got that hooch on it, you've got your choice. You can stir it in, you can pour it away, and then feed it, and it should be absolutely fine. I've known starters come back to life after months and months and months. So it's going to be absolutely fine. So what we've covered, let me just check in my questions. What's the liquid on the top? That's because it was hungry. Why isn't it growing? Usually because it's either too cold or because it's too thin. If you still aren't getting any joy with it, an easy thing to do is just try a different flour. Sometimes it just needs a different flour to give it a boost. Now, I'm a big believer in not adulterating your precious starter too much, but sometimes a different flour will help it. Sometimes it's worth using a different flour just to see what it's going to do. If that is the case, split your starter in half, split it between 2 different jars, feed one with your existing flour just to be safe and carry on, and then feed one with a different flour and see what happens. And then you might see that actually it just needs a different flour. It could also be that you try that with the water. Split it in half, keep your flour the same, try different water. That's the way that you will find what the answer is for your starter. And always keep notes. So another question that comes up a lot is, why aren't there any bubbles on the surface of my starter? This is a common misconception that a starter has to have a bubbly surface. because it doesn't. Different flours will produce a different look. So this is a starter that's been made with wholemeal, whole wheat flour, whatever you want to call it. This is a whole wheat flour starter. And what you will see is it has a very flat surface. There are no bubbles on the surface, and there don't need to be. Look at all the texture and the growth that you've got on that starter. That's all that matters. All a starter needs to do is grow. Doesn't need to be bubbly. It needs to grow, and it needs to do the job of making your dough grow. That's all that matters in this situation. So try not to focus on the look. Starters aren't about looks, it's about whether it works. So if it's got no bubbles on the surface, but it's growing like this beautifully, absolutely perfect. Your starter is great. So try not to worry about that. The only time we're worrying about the surface is if you've got this thin starter with nothing going on at all. But then that shows that there's no texture going on throughout the whole thing. If you look at the sides of these, this thin inactive starter just looks like milk. Whereas this lovely textured happy starter, this is the one that you'd want to use. So very much don't focus on looking for bubbles on the surface. It's not the answer to anything. And it doesn't matter what flour you use. A white flour starter will often have more bubbles on the surface than a whole grain one, but still you want it to grow. That's the whole point. We want to see that there's some actual reaction to when it's been fed, that it's actually growing. So let me keep on going and see what else. So when it comes to making a new starter, I'll often get messages from people saying, my starter was great, and on day 3 it had a lot of growth, day 4 it was great, and then suddenly it's not doing anything. So there's a few answers to that. The first one being, keep going. Always keep going. Starters will go through a quiet phase, and you'll see this on our full-length starter video. You'll see all the stages of making a starter. They often go through a quiet phase and then they come back again. But also sometimes at that point is when they've gotten too thin, or they've got hungry, they've been put in hot places when they don't need to, or they've done so much work that they've become hungry. So in that situation, again, that's when you want to remove half, feed it the flour only, just enough water to keep it thick, and let it carry on. But the answer to that is always keep on going. You've got to give a starter a chance. Whenever I get messages from people saying, oh, I failed, I'm sorry, fail doesn't exist in my vocabulary. Usually it's also the fact that there's nothing wrong with someone's starter, but it's all learning. We're all learning and gaining. So to me, there is no such thing as a fail anyway. So always keep on going. Go back to what I said earlier. You can look at trying different water. You can look at trying different flour. But give your starter at least 7 days to see what it's going to do. So that comes on to another question. When will my starter be ready? Can I use it on day 7? Who knows is the answer, because every starter is different. So you can't begin making a sourdough starter and decide you're definitely baking on day 7, because you need growth. So there's no hard and fast answer to that. You'll be able to use your starter once it's responded. Once you've fed it, stirred it, sat its hat on, and left it to grow for a few hours. If it's done that 2 or 3 days in a row, you're ready to go. Give your starter a go. But you can't start planning baking the second you start making a starter, because you don't know what it's going to do. Another question with a new starter, people often say, oh, I'm on to day 4, but I've missed day 4, or I've missed day 3. Is my starter, have I ruined it? Do I need to start again? Again, no, it's not ruined. Starters don't know what the day is, just like they don't know what the time is. So if you fed it at a different time of day, they're not going to care. It doesn't matter if you've missed a day, just carry on. If you've begun a starter, you're into it 4 or 5 days and suddenly you need to go away, just stick it in the fridge, leave it to go to sleep, and when you get back, take it out and carry on. It's absolutely fine. It won't get ruined. In fact, it might quite like it. Sometimes when you give them some time to ferment and just take on board the work they've been doing, they actually come out better. So don't worry about that. Often there's a question of my starter keeps getting hungry, it's overflowing, it's growing. When they're making a new one, should I feed it twice a day? No, you don't need to do that either. If you're somewhere warm or you just have a very active starter and it's growing and filling the jar like this within a few hours, put it in the fridge. Just put it in the fridge. It will slow it down. It may still keep growing a bit, but just stick it in the fridge. And then the next day, take it out, do whatever you're doing on that day, feeding it or discarding and feeding, and carry on. So the fridge is your friend here. I'm rattling through these, so let me just check and see what else I've been asked. Can I feed my starter with a different flour? Absolutely you can. Like I said earlier, I wouldn't risk it on your beautiful starter. If you've got a starter that's working very happily but you want to see what different flour does, which I wholly recommend because it is good to see what a different flour is going to do in your starter. As I said earlier, split your starter, put some into a clean jar and feed that one with the new flour, just because you don't know what the response is going to be. So definitely play with other flours. Can you use home milled flour? Absolutely. Home milled flours are going to do a great job. So play around with it. Ideally, you need some gluten in the flour. You know, all of my starters are based on using flour with gluten in. Making a gluten-free flour is a whole other thing. Making a gluten-free starter even is a whole other thing. So yes, do play around with using different flours. When you are discarding, people often say when they're making a starter and I need to discard half, do I need to measure it? Can I eyeball it? Absolutely, you can eyeball it. When you do discard, when you're making a new starter, stick that starter in another jar, stick it in the fridge. So another question I'm often asked is, how long can it live in the fridge? What do I need to do with it? That can be in there for ages, weeks, months. So if you are collecting some sourdough discard from making a new starter, you can use that whenever. The question of, do you need to discard on a regular basis? No, you don't. If you watch my sourdough, my starter video, if you look at the way I do things, you only need to discard a couple of times when you're making a new starter. You don't need to discard anymore after that. So if you want to see how I use a starter or the process of maintaining it and using it, please refer back to that video or look at our video of actually then making dough. Sometimes people will say that they've got a starter with a dry surface. So if your starter has got a really dry surface on it, I don't have one of them to show you, it will also stop it from growing. So another question when people are asking me why my starter doesn't grow, I will ask them if it's got a dry surface. So if you live somewhere that is quite dry, or if you've been putting it somewhere that's too hot, and you've kind of cooked the surface a bit, or it's just dried out, it's not going to grow because it's too heavy for it to grow and push that surface above. So in that situation, scrape off all that dry surface, feed it, put its lid back on, and let it do its thing, but don't keep doing what you've been doing. So if you've been putting it somewhere too hot, again, don't do that. If you do live somewhere that's quite dry, what you might find is that you need to keep your jar more firmly sealed to protect it, just from the dry atmosphere. So keep an eye on it with that one. But if you do live somewhere with a dry environment, that would be the reason why. Another question, do you need to use warm water in your starter? No, you don't. just use it from the tap as it comes. Another question is about the float test. If you've never heard of the float test, don't worry about it. But there is a theory that if you put a spoonful of starter in water and it floats, therefore it's ready to use. Personally, I don't recommend it. It's not reliable, it's not necessary, and there is many starters like this one, like a whole grain starter, that will sink because it's weighty. That doesn't mean it's not ready to use. The best way to tell if your starter is ready to use is if it has grown. When I fed it, this was down here, it's now up here. That is a starter that's ready to use. So get to know your starter, understand what your starter does. But don't worry about things like the float test. Pointless. Likewise, don't be worrying about gadgets and things to heat it with. You don't need them. You can manage this in your own kitchen. There will be somewhere in your kitchen that's slightly warmer if you need it. So here this morning, as you might see behind me, there's Christmas decorations. You know, it's chilly. It's been chilly in my kitchen, but I have a cupboard that has some warm pipes that run behind it when the water's on and heating's been on. So sometimes if I want it to be a little bit warmer, I might just sit it in there for an hour or two to help my starter grow. But that's as far as I will go. So if you're going to use things that heat your starter, just be very, very careful. Be careful that you're not going to end up with this. If you're going to use heat with it, then make sure that you only do it for a short amount of time. I'm just checking to see the other things that I'm asked. And a lot of these things all relate to the same thing. The questions I'm asked about starter usually are going to be about the water you're using, the flour you're using. If you use something like plain flour or a white spelt flour or something like that that's not got much body to it, they really don't grow very well. You might need a bit less water to help it along, but you're much better off with something that has got some higher protein content or something that's got some wheat germ in it if you're looking for a whole grain starter. But if you are looking at different flours in your home, personally, I would always get the best quality flour for your starter if you're having to make a choice. And stick with what works. So I feed my starter with this strong white bread flour always, but I tend to use this one in my dough, which is also a strong white bread flour, but it's just slightly different. And the reason being, because I know it works. So when you find something that works, stick with it, which is what that does. Make sure that you have a thermometer in your kitchen because that will help you. So the question of people will say, what's the ideal temperature for a starter? I don't work like that. I believe that you should learn how your kitchen works. What's the temperature in your kitchen? It's much easier to work within the temperature of your environment than with trying to control it. So this is why I always recommend keeping a journal. When you feed your starter, always note what the date is, what the time is, what the room temperature is. And then make a note of what the time was and the room temperature once it had grown and responded. If you do that across a set of months, you will have a reference and an understanding of how your starter works. I think that answers most of the questions I'm sent on a regular basis. There are probably others that come up, but these are the standard ones. These tend to be the standard concerns and the standard issues. Consistency is a massive thing. It needs to be thick. How it looks is a massive thing. All it needs to do is grow. And someone emailed me recently saying they'd got problems with their starter. It didn't look like it used to look, but it's still making great bread. It's still making the dough grow. So my answer to that is, if it's doing the job it needs to do, there's no problem. So try not to focus on the look thing. Focus on making sure it works. So I really hope that this answers most of the questions that I'm asked about starters. The big one being, like I said at the beginning, is people assuming their starter's dead and they have to throw it away. please don't throw your starters away, because it's really usually not a problem. We are in my home kitchen, and I can see someone's about to knock on my door, because that's what happens when you were filming and working in a home kitchen. So luckily I don't have a big loud door knocker anymore. So apologies for that. Let me just check. There you go. There's the knock at the door. Luckily these days they leave things on the doorstep. It's fine, James. You don't need to go. So, big thing is heat. Another thing, just to cover it, is humidity. If you live somewhere that's very humid, that can affect your starter because it's putting more moisture into it. So again, you might be needing to use a bit less water with that one. If you're using soft or filtered water, that might affect it. The person at the door definitely wants a response. So excuse us for a second. This is real life. Normally they just leave it on the doorstep, but on this occasion they're not. Humidity will make a difference to your starter because it's adding moisture from the air. If you use soft or filtered water, that can make a difference to your starter. You might need to use a bit less of the water. If you're using a weak flour, that might prevent your starter from growing too much. If it smells really strongly, often there's a question of, why does my starter smell so strongly? James is just going to go back behind the camera now. If a starter smells very strongly, often that's because it's hungry. Okay, so that will disappear once you've fed it. Yeah, so I think we've covered just about everything on this. Something else I'm often asked about is ratios. And what's all this stuff about feeding your starter ratios? So if you've seen stuff online that is saying feed your starter 1-2-2, feed your starter 1-5-5, or anything like that, again, I don't use any of that. You don't need to use any of that. All you need to do is know how much you want in your dough. So I feed my starter based on what I want it to produce. So however much you begin with, I always recommend keeping between 50 and 80 grams of starter as your base amount. Feed it based on what you want for your dough. So if you want 100 grams of starter for your dough, feed it 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour, assuming you're not needing to tweak any of them. Once you take out what you need, you'll return it back to that base amount, goes in the fridge, job done. So therefore you're not discarding, you're not needing to figure out percentages, ratios, or anything like that. So feed your starter based on what you need it to produce, and feed it based on what it needs. So this is when you need to get to know your starter. This is what goes back to, does your starter need a bit less water? Does your starter need a bit more water? Do you need to tweak something along the way? And it's okay to do that, because you need to get your starter working for you. So get to know your starter, get to understand what makes it work best, and go with that. Don't read all this stuff online. Don't get pulled into, well, I do this and I do that, you should be doing this. All you need to do is understand how your starter works in your kitchen with your flour, your water, and your room temperature. And that's the best way to then work with your kitchen, work with your starter in your kitchen even. So hopefully this has all been useful. There is another video coming, which is going to be answering all the frequently asked questions I get about dough and about loaves and baking. You can find everything that I know and I can tell you about in my book, The Sourdough Bible. It answers every possible question I've been asked before you even knew you had it. So if you want a written reference, it's in that book. It's my most comprehensive book I've written, and it's got everything in there that you need. Do check our full-length How to Make a Starter video as well. Even if you've already made a starter, it answers questions about starters as well that may help you. But other than that, I hope this has been useful, and greetings from my kitchen and to yours, and happy baking. Enjoy your starter babies.